At my granddaughter's wedding, I realized I wasn't a guest. I was a punchline printed in elegant ink. I noticed it the moment the young woman at the reception table handed me my name tag with a bright, practiced smile, the kind you give without really looking at the person in front of you. And when I glanced down, expecting to see Margaret Collins, grandmother of the bride, I saw instead, in delicate calligraphy, the old lady who's paying for everything. And for a second, just a second, my fingers froze around the edge of the card as if the paper itself had weight, as if those few words had somehow managed to press down on my chest harder than the years ever had. But I didn't say anything. I didn't frown. I didn't even hesitate long enough for anyone to notice. I simply smiled, the same polite smile I had worn through decades of family dinners and quiet compromises, and pinned the tag to my dress as if it belonged there, as if it were just another detail in a day that was supposed to be perfect, because that's what this day was meant to be. Emily's wedding, my granddaughter, the little girl who used to sit on my kitchen counter swinging her legs while I baked cookies, now walking down the aisle in a gown I had helped pay for, in a ballroom I had booked, under chandeliers I had chosen during a long afternoon, with a planner who kept calling me ma'am, in that overly sweet tone. And as I stepped into the reception hall, the soft music and warm lighting wrapped around me like nothing had happened at all. Guests were laughing, glasses were clinking, waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of champagne, and everything looked exactly the way I had imagined it would when I signed the final check 3 weeks ago. Except now there was a quiet shift, something just beneath the surface, because once you see something like that, once you read words like those attached to your name, you start noticing other things too. The way a woman near the bar glanced at my chest and quickly looked away. The way 2 men in suits leaned slightly closer together as I passed, their voices dropping into a whisper that didn't quite hide the edge of amusement. And still, I kept walking, slow and steady, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, my posture straight, my chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that dignity doesn't come from how people treat you. It comes from how you carry yourself when they don't. And so I moved through that room like I belonged there. Like I wasn't aware of the quiet jokes stitched into my identity for the evening. Like I hadn't just been reduced to a role I never agreed to play. And when I reached my table and gently set my clutch down beside my plate, I smoothed the front of my dress, the pale blue fabric catching the light just the way Robert used to say it did when he'd stand behind me and rest his hands on my shoulders before a night out. And for a brief moment, I let myself imagine he was still there, that he could see this, that he would lean in and whisper something steady and reassuring, something that would make all of this feel smaller, less intentional, less cruel. But the chair beside me remained empty, just as it had been for the past 3 years, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever message had been written in that careful script and pinned over my heart, I was going to have to face it alone, just as I had faced everything else since the day I lost him. And somewhere across the room, I caught sight of Pamela, my daughter-in-law, laughing a little too brightly as she adjusted a centerpiece, her eyes scanning the crowd with a kind of satisfaction that didn't quite match the occasion. And when her gaze brushed past me, just for a second, I saw it. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, as if she had been waiting to see whether I would notice, whether I would react. And when I didn't, when I simply met her eyes and gave a small, composed nod, her smile didn't falter, but something in it sharpened, just slightly, just enough for me to understand that whatever had started with a name tag was not accidental, and whatever came next was already in motion. I took my seat as if nothing had shifted, as if the room had not quietly rearranged itself around a single line of ink pinned to my chest. And for a while, it almost worked, because people approached me the way they always had, with polite smiles and light conversation, asking about the flowers, the music, the catering, all the details I had spent months carefully choosing, and I answered them calmly, my voice steady, my hands resting lightly in my lap. But I noticed something new in their eyes, a flicker of curiosity, sometimes amusement, sometimes discomfort, as their gaze dropped for just a moment before returning to my face. And each time it happened, I felt it, not as a sharp pain, but as a quiet pressure, like a bruise forming beneath the surface. And still, I did not touch the name tag. I did not remove it. I I let it remain exactly where it was, as if acknowledging it would somehow give it more weight than I was willing to allow. And across the room, laughter rose and fell in soft waves, glasses clinked. A string quartet played something gentle and familiar, and everything sounded exactly the way a wedding should sound. Except now there was a layer beneath it, something thinner, sharper, like a note just slightly out of tune. And as the evening unfolded, I began to notice patterns, small things at first, the way Pamela moved through the room with a kind of careful awareness, always positioning herself near groups of guests just long enough to be seen, to be heard, to guide conversations without appearing to lead them. The way Richard stayed close to her side, nodding along, smiling when she smiled, laughing when she laughed, as if his reactions were no longer entirely his own. And once, as I stood near the bar waiting for a glass of water, I heard it clearly, not directed at me, not meant for me, but not hidden well enough either. "Did you see her tag?" A woman's voice said softly, followed by a quiet chuckle. Pamela said it was her idea, something lighthearted, you know, since she covered most of the wedding. And another voice responded, lower, uncertain, "I thought her mother-in-law paid for it." And there was a pause, just long enough to carry meaning, before the first voice returned, lighter this time. "Well, that is what she wants people to think." And then the conversation shifted, as if it had never happened at all, but the words stayed with me, settling into place with a precision that felt almost practiced, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the cool glass of water untouched in my hand, my mind moving quietly, not racing, not panicking, just observing, connecting, and for the first time that evening, something inside me shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, like a door, closing softly behind me, because this was not a careless joke, not an unfortunate mistake. This was something constructed, something placed deliberately into the fabric of the evening, and I began to see the threads, the way certain guests avoided meeting my eyes for too long, the way others looked at me with a kind of polite sympathy that felt almost rehearsed, the way Pamela's laughter carried just a fraction too far whenever she was within earshot of my table. And still, I said nothing. I returned to my seat. I folded my hands neatly. I listened as the speeches began, each one filled with warmth and gratitude and carefully chosen words about family and love and generosity. And when my name was mentioned, it was brief, almost an afterthought, a passing acknowledgement that barely lingered in the air before moving on. And I realized then that the role I had been given tonight was not the one I had believed I was playing. It was smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, and for years, I might have accepted that without question. I might have told myself it did not matter, that what mattered was that Emily was happy, that the family was together, that everything had come together beautifully. But as I sat there, listening to the applause rise and fall around me, I understood something with a clarity that surprised even me. I was not being overlooked. I was being repositioned, carefully, intentionally. And once you see something like that, once you recognize it for what it is, you cannot unsee it. And you cannot go back to being the person who simply smiles and pays the bill without asking why. By the time dinner was served, I no longer felt like a participant in the evening, but rather an observer seated at the edge of something carefully orchestrated, and the realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in a quiet room, each small detail adding weight to what I already knew. Because once the idea had taken root, once I had allowed myself to consider that none of this was accidental, everything else began to align with an almost unsettling clarity. The way Pamela leaned slightly toward a group of guests at the neighboring table, her voice low, but not low enough, her tone light, but edged with something sharper. "It has been a long journey pulling all of this together," she said, gesturing subtly around the room. "But I wanted Emily to have something truly special." And someone responded with admiration, praising the elegance of the evening, the attention to detail, the generosity behind it all. And Pamela smiled, accepting it with a modest tilt of her head, not correcting them, not redirecting the credit, just allowing the assumption to settle exactly where she wanted it. And I watched Richard beside her, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, his expression easy, agreeable, as if there was nothing unusual about the way the story was being told, as if this version of events was the only one that had ever existed. And for a moment, I studied him, really studied him, searching for something familiar, something that belonged to the boy who used to look at me with uncomplicated trust. But what I saw instead was distance, not coldness, not hostility, just a quiet willingness to stand where he was placed, to accept the shape of things as they were presented to him. And I realized then that whatever this was, it had not begun tonight. It had been building for some time, layered carefully, reinforced through small moments I had dismissed or explained away, the missed calls, the shortened visits, the subtle shifts in tone that I had told myself were just part of life changing. And now, sitting there, beneath soft lighting and polite conversation, those moments returned to me one by one, fitting together with a precision that felt almost deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle I had never intended to solve. And across the table, Emily laughed at something her friend had said, her face bright, her happiness genuine, untouched by the undercurrent moving quietly beneath the surface, and I felt a brief, unexpected sense of relief that at least she remained separate from whatever game was being played around her, because this was her day, and I would not allow my understanding of the situation to take that from her. But even that thought carried a quiet edge, because it meant acknowledging that there was, in fact, something to take, something fragile enough to be affected. And as the plates were cleared and the speeches gave way to music, I stood slowly, smoothing my dress once more, and made my way toward the far side of the room, not to escape, not to withdraw, but to see more clearly, to listen without being seen listening. And it was there, near a tall arrangement of white roses, that I heard it again, more direct this time, unmistakable. She does not even realize how much she is spending. A voice said softly, followed by a quiet laugh. Pamela told me she insisted on handling the finances this time, said it was easier that way. And another voice responded, curious, so the mother-in-law just signs off on everything? And the first voice answered without hesitation. Exactly, she trusts them completely. And there it was, simple, clean, and undeniable, not just a moment of embarrassment, not just a careless joke, but a narrative, one that had been shaped and repeated until it sounded natural, until it felt true to anyone who heard it. And I stood there for a moment, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my expression unchanged, but inside, something settled into place with a quiet finality, because understanding has a way of removing doubt, and without doubt, there is no confusion, only clarity. And with that clarity came something else, something steady and controlled, not anger, not hurt, but awareness, the kind that changes how you move, how you listen, how you choose your next step. And as I turned back toward the center of the room, toward the music and the laughter and the carefully maintained illusion of celebration, I knew that whatever role I had been assigned tonight, it was not one I intended to keep playing for long. The music grew louder as the night moved forward, but to me, everything seemed quieter, as if the room had been placed behind a pane of glass, and I was watching it from the outside. And with that distance came something unexpected, not sorrow, not even disappointment, but a kind of clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because it forced me to look backward, not at this evening, not at the carefully arranged tables or the curated smiles, but at the years that had led me here, and one by one, moments began to surface, small at the time, easy to dismiss, the kind of things you excuse when you want to believe the best in people. I remembered the first time Pamela suggested that she handle the holiday planning, how she had framed it as a kindness, a way to take the burden off my shoulders, and how grateful I had been, stepping back without question, believing I was being included in a thoughtful gesture. And then there were the quiet changes that followed, the guest lists I no longer saw, the menus I no longer chose, the subtle shift from asking my opinion to informing me of decisions already made, and each time, I had told myself it was natural, that families evolve, that roles change, that I did not need to be at the center of everything to still be valued. And then came the finances, always presented with a tone of efficiency, of practicality. It is easier if we consolidate things, Pamela had said once, her voice smooth, her reasoning sound, and I had agreed, not because I was convinced, but because I trusted, because I believed that trust was something you extended without keeping score. And as those memories aligned themselves with what I was now seeing, I began to understand that none of it had been abrupt, none of it had required confrontation. It had been a gradual repositioning, a quiet shift from involvement to distance, from decision maker to silent contributor. And the more I thought about it, the more precise it seemed, like a series of steps, carefully placed so that I would not notice the ground changing beneath me until it was already different. And yet, what struck me most was not the strategy itself, but my own willingness to accept it. The way I had chosen comfort over clarity. The way I had avoided asking questions that might have disrupted the peace I believed we had. And as I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching couples move in soft circles under the glow of warm lights, I felt a strange sense of detachment from the version of myself who had made those choices, not with regret, not with self-reproach, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, because understanding does not always come with blame. Sometimes it simply arrives, steady and undeniable, and changes the way you see everything that came before it. And across the room, I saw Pamela again, speaking with a group of guests, her posture relaxed, her gestures controlled, every movement measured in a way that suggested confidence, ownership. And for the first time, I did not see her as someone who had simply overstepped. I saw her as someone who had taken exactly what had been left, unguarded, someone who had recognized an opening and moved through it without hesitation. And that realization did not anger me. It clarified things, because it meant that this was not about misunderstanding, not about miscommunication. It was about control, about narrative, about deciding who would be seen and who would not. And as I reached up and lightly adjusted the edge of the name tag pinned to my dress, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, I understood that it was never just a label. It was a message, a carefully placed signal about where I was expected to stand in this family, how I was meant to be perceived, and perhaps even how I was supposed to see myself. And for years, in ways both large and small, I had accepted that positioning without resistance. I had stepped back when asked. I had contributed without acknowledgement. I had remained silent when silence felt easier than conflict. But standing there now, with the music continuing and the celebration unfolding as if nothing were out of place, I realized that silence is not always neutral. Sometimes it is permission, and once that truth settles in, once it takes hold, it becomes impossible to ignore, because it does not ask for a reaction. It demands a decision. And as I lowered my hand and let the name tag rest exactly where it had been placed, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what they expected of me, but by what I chose to allow. And for the first time that evening, that choice felt entirely my own. It was somewhere between the second glass of champagne being poured at nearby tables and the soft shift of music into something slower that I noticed him standing near the far end of the room, just beyond the tall windows that overlooked the dark outline of the garden. And for a moment, I did not recognize him, not because he had changed so much, but because I had not expected to see him here, not tonight, not in a place that felt so carefully curated. But then he turned slightly, the light catching his profile in a way that felt familiar, and I realized it was Thomas Green, my late husband's attorney, a man who had been part of our lives for over 30 years, always quiet, always precise, the kind of person who never spoke more than necessary but never missed anything worth noticing. And as if he had felt my gaze, he looked up and met my eyes with a small, acknowledging nod, not surprised, not overly warm, just steady, and without thinking too much about it, I made my way toward him, my steps unhurried, my expression composed, because if there was one person in that room who existed outside the delicate web of appearances surrounding the evening, it was him. And when I reached his side, he offered a polite smile, the kind that carried recognition without intrusion. "Margaret," he said simply, his voice as calm as I remembered, and I returned the greeting with the same measured tone. Neither of us rushing into conversation, neither of us pretending this was an ordinary encounter. And for a brief moment, we stood there in silence, watching the movement of the room, the slow turning of couples on the dance floor, the careful choreography of a celebration that now felt more like a performance than a gathering. And then he spoke again, quietly. "I was not sure if you would recognize me," and I allowed myself a small smile. "Some things are easier to recognize than others," I replied, my words carrying more meaning than they appeared to on the surface, and he seemed to understand that, because his expression shifted slightly, not into concern, not into sympathy, but into something more observant, more attentive, as if he was taking note of something that had not been there before. And after a pause, He glanced briefly at the name tag pinned to my dress, not lingering on it, not commenting, just acknowledging its presence with the kind of subtle awareness that did not require explanation. And then, in the same quiet tone, he said, "I have been meaning to speak with you." And there was something in the way he said it that cut cleanly through the noise of the room. Not urgent, not alarming, but deliberate. And I felt that same internal stillness settle in, the one that had been growing stronger throughout the evening, because I understood, without needing further clarification, that whatever he had to say was not about the flowers, or the music, or the success of the event. It belonged to something deeper, something that had likely been waiting for the right moment. And I nodded once, indicating that I was listening. And he continued, his voice low enough to remain private. "Your husband made certain arrangements before he passed, details that were meant to be discussed with you directly, but the timing never seemed appropriate." And he paused briefly, as if choosing his words with care. I had assumed those conversations had already taken place, and there it was again, that quiet shift, that subtle confirmation that something had been moving beneath the surface long before tonight. And I felt no surge of panic, no rush of questions, only a steady awareness that whatever I was beginning to understand was not new. It had simply been kept just out of reach, and I met his gaze evenly. "They have not," I said, my tone calm, almost neutral, and he inclined his head slightly, as if that answer aligned with something he had already suspected, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the music continuing behind us, laughter rising and falling in the distance. But between us, there was a different kind of conversation, unfolding, one that did not rely on volume or urgency, only on clarity. And then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, neatly folded document, not offering it immediately, but holding it with a quiet sense of intention. "When you are ready," he said, placing it gently into my hand. "You may want to review this," and I accepted it without hesitation. The paper light against my fingers, yet carrying a weight that felt far more significant than anything else I had touched that evening. And as I looked down at it briefly before closing my hand around it, I understood something with absolute certainty. The narrative I had been placed inside was not as complete as it appeared, and whatever had been decided about my role in this family, whatever assumptions had been made about what I knew or did not know, they were about to meet something they had not accounted for. And as I lifted my gaze back to Thomas, offering him a quiet nod of acknowledgement, I felt that same calm settle deeper within me, not as resignation, but as control, because for the first time that night, I was no longer simply observing what had been arranged around me. I was beginning to see the edges of something else entirely, something that had been waiting, patiently, for me to notice. I did not open the document right away, not because I was unsure of what it might contain, but because I understood that timing mattered, that there was a difference between reacting and choosing. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer interested in reacting, so instead, I slipped the folded paper into my clutch with the same calm precision I had used when pinning the name tag to my dress. And I returned to the center of the room as if nothing had changed, as if I were still the same woman who had arrived earlier that evening believing she understood her place. But inside, something had shifted with quiet certainty, and it affected everything. The way I walked, the way I looked at people, the way I listened, because now, I was not just hearing words, I was measuring them. Not just seeing gestures, I was reading them. And when I passed by Pamela again, I noticed the brief flicker in her eyes as she glanced at me. Not long enough for anyone else to catch, but long enough for me to recognize that she was checking, assessing, perhaps even waiting for a reaction that had not come, and I gave her nothing, not even a hint of discomfort, just the same composed expression, the same quiet presence, and if anything, that seemed to unsettle her more than any confrontation would have. Because people who build their control on perception rely on visible responses, and, without them, their certainty begins to thin. And I took my seat once more as the final round of speeches was announced, the room settling into a softer rhythm, conversations lowering, attention shifting toward the small stage at the front, and as one speaker followed another, offering carefully prepared words about love, commitment, and family, I found myself listening in a different way, not for sentiment, but for alignment, for the subtle ways in which stories were shaped, for the names that were emphasized and the ones that were only briefly acknowledged. and it became clear that the narrative had been consistent throughout the evening, polished, repeated, reinforced, until it felt seamless, until it required no explanation. And yet, now that I could see it, it no longer felt seamless at all. It felt constructed, deliberate, almost fragile in its precision. And as that thought settled in, I reached down slowly and opened my clutch just enough to touch the edge of the folded document, not unfolding it, not reading it yet, just feeling its presence, a quiet reminder that there was more to this story than what had been presented, more than what had been assumed, and the awareness of that alone was enough to steady me further, because it meant that whatever had been decided about me, whatever role I had been assigned, it had been based on incomplete information. And there is a certain kind of strength that comes from knowing something others do not loud, not obvious, but deeply grounding. And as the final speaker stepped away from the microphone and the room filled with applause, I noticed a subtle shift in Pamela's posture, a small glance toward the coordinator, a signal that something was about to happen, something planned. And a moment later, her voice carried across the room, warm and confident as she thanked everyone for coming and invited a few final acknowledgments before the evening moved into dancing. And when she spoke my name, it was with that same light tone, almost playful. "And of course, we cannot forget the woman who made all of this possible," she said, gesturing in my direction as a few heads turned. "The one who believes in family enough to support it so generously." And there was laughter, soft, polite, but unmistakable. And for a brief moment, all eyes rested on me, waiting, expecting something, a smile, a nod, perhaps even a small wave, the kind of response that would confirm the role that had been carefully built for me throughout the night. But I did not move immediately. I allowed the moment to linger just long enough to feel its full weight, not as embarrassment, but as clarity, because this was not recognition, it was reinforcement, a final layer added to a story that had already been told. And then, slowly, I stood, not with hesitation, not with discomfort, but with quiet intention, my posture straight, my expression calm, and I met Pamela's gaze directly, holding it for just a second longer than expected, not challenging, not confrontational, just present. And then I inclined my head slightly, a gesture that could be read in any number of ways: gratitude, acknowledgement, acceptance, depending on what someone wanted to see. And that was the point, because for the first time that evening, I understood that perception was not something to defend against, it was something to shape. And as I sat back down, the applause fading into the background, I knew that whatever came next would not be dictated by what had been said about me, but by what I chose to reveal, and more importantly, when I chose to reveal it. The moment passed as all moments do, absorbed into the rhythm of the evening. But something had changed in the space it left behind, something subtle yet irreversible, and I could feel it in the way the room no longer pressed in on me the same way it had before, as if the expectations that had once surrounded me had loosened, not because they had disappeared, but because I had stepped outside of them without anyone quite realizing it yet. And as the music resumed and guests began to move more freely across the floor, I remained seated for a few seconds longer, my hands resting lightly against the table, my gaze steady, allowing the quiet after that small public acknowledgement to settle fully before I moved again. And when I did stand, it was not to follow the flow of the evening, but to shift my position within it, to observe from a different angle, because now I was no longer simply watching for understanding, I was watching for confirmation, and it did not take long to find it, not in grand gestures or obvious displays, but in the smaller exchanges that often go unnoticed, the brief conversations held just out of focus, the subtle glances exchanged between people who believe they are not being observed. And as I moved toward the far side of the room once more, I noticed Pamela speaking with the event coordinator, her voice low, her expression composed, but there was a slight tension in her posture now, a carefulness that had not been there earlier. And when the coordinator nodded and walked away, Pamela's gaze lifted and scanned the room, pausing for a fraction of a second when it found me. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, not confidence, not control, but calculation, as if she were reassessing something that no longer aligned with her expectations. And I held her gaze just long enough to let her know that I had noticed, before continuing on as if nothing had passed between us, because sometimes acknowledgement is enough to shift the balance. And near the edge of the dance floor, I found myself beside a small group of guests who were engaged in quiet conversation. Their voices low but not guarded, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are among those who share the same understanding. And I did not interrupt. I did not announce my presence. I simply stood there, close enough to listen, and after a moment, the conversation revealed itself without effort. I heard there were some changes to the accounts recently. One man said, his voice measured, something about restructuring after her husband passed, and another responded, "That makes sense, especially if someone else is handling things now." And there was a pause, followed by a softer voice, almost thoughtful. "It is easier that way, especially when trust is involved." And I felt the weight of that word settle in. Trust, used so lightly, so confidently, as if it were a fixed thing rather than something that could be shaped, redirected, even used. And for a moment, I considered stepping away, leaving the conversation as it was. But instead, I remained, not to confront, not to correct, but to listen just a little longer, because there is a certain value in hearing how a story is told when you are not expected to be part of it. And what I heard was not anger, not even malice. It was assumption, built carefully over time, reinforced by consistency, accepted because it had never been challenged. And that realization did not unsettle me. It clarified the scale of what I was dealing with. Because changing a moment is simple, but shifting a narrative requires precision. And as the conversation drifted into other topics, I stepped away quietly, my thoughts settling into a calm, deliberate pattern, because I understood now that whatever I chose to do next would not only affect the people directly involved, it would reshape the understanding that had been built around me. And that required more than reaction. It required timing. And as I made my way back toward the center of the room, I reached into my clutch once more, this time allowing my fingers to unfold the document just enough to catch a glimpse of the first line, the text neat, formal, unmistakable. And even in that brief glance, I recognized its significance, not in detail, but in direction, and I closed it again carefully, not needing to read further to understand what it represented. Because sometimes it is not the full picture that changes everything. It is the confirmation that there is one. And as I lifted my gaze and allowed myself to take in the room once more, the music, the laughter, the carefully arranged celebration, I felt something settle into place with quiet certainty, not urgency, not emotion, but readiness. Because for the first time that evening, I was no longer trying to understand what had been done. I was deciding what I would do about it. And that difference changed everything. The decision, once it settled, did not feel dramatic. It felt precise, like placing a single piece into a structure that had been waiting for it. And I moved through the room with that same quiet certainty, not hurried, not hesitant, simply aware. And when I reached the table where the coordinator stood reviewing a small stack of notes, I paused just long enough to catch her attention, my expression calm, my voice steady as I spoke, asking a simple question about the schedule, about whether there would be time for one final acknowledgement before the evening shifted fully into dancing. And she hesitated for only a fraction of a second, glancing toward Pamela as if seeking confirmation. But Pamela was across the room, engaged in conversation, her attention elsewhere. And so the coordinator nodded politely, accommodating, unaware of the significance of what she had just agreed to. And I thanked her with a small, measured smile before stepping back, returning once more to my seat, where I allowed a few minutes to pass, just enough for the rhythm of the evening to settle again, just enough for the earlier moment to fade into the background of memory for those who had witnessed it, because timing, I had learned, is not about acting quickly. It is about acting when attention is ready to shift, and when the music softened and the lights adjusted slightly, signaling a transition, I stood again, this time with purpose that did not need to be announced, and I made my way toward the front of the room, not drawing attention, not calling for it, simply moving with a quiet presence that people noticed only after I had already arrived. And when I reached the small stage, the microphone waiting exactly where it had been left, there was a brief pause in the room, a subtle ripple of curiosity as conversations quieted just enough to make space for something unplanned, and I did not rush into speech. I allowed the silence to form naturally, to gather the attention that had not been explicitly requested, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, clear, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without forcing its way there. I will not take much of your time. I began, my words simple, unembellished. But I believe it is important, on evenings like this, to make sure that what is seen matches what is true. And there was a stillness that followed, not confusion, not yet, but a shift, a subtle awareness that something had changed, and I continued, not looking at anyone in particular at first, allowing my gaze to move naturally across the room. Family, as we often describe it, is built on trust, on understanding, and on the belief that we are all standing in the same story. And I paused briefly, just long enough for the words to settle, for their meaning to begin to take shape. But sometimes, that story is told in a way that leaves certain details unspoken. And as I said that, my eyes found Pamela, not sharply, not accusingly, just directly. And for the first time that evening, her composure shifted in a way that could not be entirely hidden, a small tightening at the edge of her expression, a brief stillness that spoke louder than any reaction. And I did not press that moment. I simply acknowledged it with the same calm presence I had carried throughout the night, before continuing. I have spent many years believing that silence was a form of support, that stepping back was a way of allowing others to step forward. And I reached into my clutch then, slowly, deliberately, withdrawing the folded document that had rested there all evening. But I have also learned that silence can create misunderstandings, and I unfolded the paper with steady hands, not dramatically, not for effect, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understands exactly what they are holding. And misunderstandings, when left unaddressed, have a way of becoming accepted as truth. And I glanced down briefly, not to read every word, but to anchor what I was about to say in something real, something undeniable, before lifting my gaze once more. So tonight, I would simply like to clarify something. And the room, though still outwardly composed, had shifted entirely now, attention no longer scattered but focused, not on the celebration, but on me, on what I was choosing to reveal. And in that moment, I understood that control had already begun to change hands, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And as I held the document lightly in my hand, I allowed one final pause to settle into the room, knowing that what came next would not need to be loud to be heard. Before my husband passed, he made sure that I would never have to wonder where I stood in this family. I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough weight to hold the room in place. And I let that sentence settle, not rushing to fill the silence that followed, because silence, when used correctly, has a way of drawing people closer, of making them listen more carefully than any raised voice ever could. And as I glanced briefly down at the document in my hand, I continued, he believed in clarity, in putting things in writing so that there would be no confusion, no assumptions, no room for stories to be shaped by convenience. And I could feel the shift now, not just in the stillness of the room, but in the attention itself, the way it tightened, focused, as if every person present understood, even if only instinctively, that what they were hearing was not part of the evening's original plan. And I lifted the paper slightly, not as a display, but as a quiet acknowledgement of its presence. This document outlines the structure of our family estate, the decisions that were made together, long before tonight, long before any of us had reason to question them. And I paused again, not for effect, but to allow the meaning to settle where it needed to. And when I looked up, my gaze moved naturally across the room until it rested, briefly, on Pamela and Richard, who now stood side by side, their expressions composed but no longer effortless. And I did not hold that gaze long. I did not need to, because what mattered was not confrontation, it was clarity. And I continued, according to these arrangements, every major financial decision, every allocation, every contribution, remains under my direct authority, not delegated, not transferred, not assumed, but clearly and legally defined. And there was a subtle reaction to that, not loud, not disruptive, but present, a ripple of understanding that moved through the room in quiet waves, and I let it move. I did not interrupt it, because this was not about controlling the reaction, it was about allowing the truth to stand on its own. And after a moment, I added, which means that any impression suggesting otherwise is exactly that, an impression, not a fact. And the distinction hung there, simple, undeniable, and I could feel the weight of it shifting the atmosphere, not dramatically, not with visible disruption, but with a kind of quiet correction, as if something that had been slightly off had just been set back into place, and I lowered the document then, folding it carefully, returning it to my clutch with the same calm precision I had carried all evening. Because the purpose had already been served, the message delivered, and there was nothing to be gained from extending it further. And when I spoke again, my tone did not harden, it did not sharpen, it remained exactly as it had been, measured, composed. I have always believed that support does not require recognition, and that generosity does not need to be announced. I said, my eyes moving once more across the room, not searching, not accusing, simply present. But I also believe that understanding matters, that knowing where things truly stand is a form of respect, not just for me, but for everyone involved. And I allowed a small pause then, not to invite response, but to close the space naturally. So tonight, I simply wanted to make that clear, and with that, I inclined my head slightly, a gesture that could be read as gratitude, as closure, as finality, depending on who was watching, and I stepped back from the microphone without waiting for applause, without seeking acknowledgement, because none of that was necessary. The room had already shifted, the narrative had already been adjusted, and as I moved away from the stage, returning to the quiet flow of the evening, I could feel the difference in the way people looked at me, not with curiosity now, not with amusement, but with something steadier, something more aligned with reality, and I did not linger to measure it. I did not stay to confirm it, because I did not need to, and when I reached the edge of the room, I paused only long enough to remove the name tag from my dress, holding it for a brief moment between my fingers before placing it gently on the nearest table, not as a rejection, not as a statement, but as a simple correction, and then I walked toward the exit with the same calm, unhurried steps I had carried all evening, not looking back, not because there was nothing left behind, but because for the first time in a very long time, I no longer needed to see how I was being seen to understand exactly who I was.